Giselle's laugh cut through the ballroom like broken glass. Smile, Callista. Let them see what failure looks like. Sherri leaned in, venom sweet. One signature and your family again. Lyle swirled his scotch. Or you leave in cuffs. Your choice. A pink portfolio slammed into my hands. Trap bait dressed as mercy. Kael's whisper grazed my ear. 8 p.m. Omega goes live. I swallowed the humiliation, tasted blood behind my teeth, and stepped forward anyway. Because tonight wasn't about surviving their spotlight. It was about walking into it and turning it into a funeral. I stepped into the grand ballroom of the Peninsula, Chicago, not as a daughter returning home, but as a ghost haunting a palace of glass. The air was thick, heavy with the cloying scent of 1,000 white carnations. Mother's favorite. To the 600 guests sipping vintage Cristal, it was the fragrance of luxury. To me, it smelled like a funeral for a relationship that had died a decade ago. I smoothed the fabric of my black silk dress, a simple piece I'd bought off a rack in West Loop. It didn't have a designer label, but it fit me like armor. I watched Gisselle Vantage standing under the central chandelier, the queen of media herself, radiating a glow that was as brilliant as it was artificial. She smiled for the cameras, a practiced curve of the lips that never quite reached her cold, calculating eyes. Character is fate, my grandfather used to say. Looking at her, I realized her fate was to be a masterpiece with a hollow core. I didn't come here tonight to beg for a seat at her table, or to ask for the crumbs of her affection. I had spent the last 8 years building a table of my own in the shadows of Silicon Valley. Yet as I moved through the crowd, I felt the familiar chill of being an outsider in my own bloodline. An elderly server tripped near the appetizer station, his tray of caviar blinis wobbling precariously. I reached out instinctively, steadying his arm with a firm grip before the disaster could strike. He looked at me with startled, tired eyes, whispering a shaky thank you. Take your time, I said softly, offering a small smile. The night is long, and no one here is actually hungry. I reminded myself then that power without compassion is just a well-dressed cage. Gisselle lived in that cage, and tonight, she intended to lock me in it with her. The rhythmic clink of ice against crystal signaled the arrival of my siblings. Sherri and Lyle approached like a pair of predators who had just scented blood. Sherri was draped in a Vera Wang original, her neck sparkling with a Harry Winston necklace that cost more than a Midwestern home. Lyle looked flushed, his eyes glassy from too much pre-game scotch, his arrogance as loud as his tailored tuxedo. "Callista, look at you!" Sherri sneered, her eyes raking over my unbranded dress with practiced disdain. "Did you take the bus here, or did the shelter give you a day pass for Mother's Day?" Lyle let out a sharp, jagged laugh that drew the attention of a nearby senator. They had no idea that the very floor they stood on was being supported by my silent investments. They saw a failure. I saw a debt that was about to be called due. Sherri didn't wait for a response before thrusting a pink leather portfolio into my hands. "Don't say we never gave you anything," she whispered, her voice a poisonous honey. "Mother decided it was time to bring you back into the fold. It's a seat on the board of Vantage South. Consider it your final chance to be more than a footnote." My legal intuition, honed through years of navigating the cutthroat waters of Black Helix, flared white-hot. I didn't need to open the folder to know there was a hook in the bait. In the high-stakes world of Chicago business, a gift from Gisselle Vantage was usually a death warrant wrapped in silk. I felt the weight of the paper in my hand, heavy with the intent of a woman who viewed her youngest child as a liability to be liquidated. I moved to a quieter corner and flipped open the portfolio. My eyes raced across the clauses, bypassing the flowery language of familial unity, to find the jagged teeth of the law. There it was, a responsible officer designation for a Vantage subsidiary burdened with $200 million in toxic infrastructure debt. Under Illinois corporate law, accepting this seat meant I was personally assuming the fiduciary risk. If the subsidiary collapsed, and looking at these numbers, it was designed to fall by Monday morning, the federal investigators wouldn't go to Giselle's penthouse. They would come for me. They weren't inviting me home. They were choosing their sacrificial lamb. Wisdom is knowing when to stay silent and when to let the law speak for you. I tucked the papers away, my knuckles whitening, but my face remained an unreadable mask of stoic calm. The lights dimmed, and a spotlight cut through the room, pinning Gisselle to the stage like a butterfly on a board. It was time for her Mother of the Year acceptance speech. She gripped the microphone, her voice booming with a false warmth that filled every corner of the ballroom. She spoke of legacy, of sacrifice, and of the burden of leadership. Then her eyes found me in the back of the room. The air seemed to vanish. Success is bittersweet when not everyone shares the vision, she began, her tone shifting to a mock-sorrowful cadence. Tonight, I must acknowledge the family disgrace. My youngest, Callista, who refused to contribute, who turned her back on our name, and who prefers the shadows of the streets to the light of this family. A massive screen behind her flickered to life, revealing a grainy, doctored video. It showed clips of me from years ago, working a late shift at a dive bar to pay for my night classes, framed to look like I was living a life of scandal and ruin. The ballroom erupted in a wave of cruel, rhythmic laughter. I stood there, the target of a public crucifixion, watching the mother who had given me life try to steal my dignity for a PR stunt. I looked at her and felt a profound, aching sadness, not for the girl on the screen, but for the woman on the stage. A parent who destroys their child to save their image has already lost everything that truly matters. Gisselle was a billionaire in name, but a pauper in spirit. I checked the watch hidden beneath my sleeve. It was 8 p.m. In the world of global finance, the sun was rising on the other side of the world, and my private equity triggers were finally live. I caught Kael's eye across the room. He gave a single, imperceptible nod. The trap he and I had built over 2 years of silent accumulation was finally ready to spring. Gisselle raised her champagne glass to the crowd, her face twisted in a mask of maternal disappointment as she signaled for security to show me the door. She thought this was the end of my story. She didn't realize it was the first 10 minutes of hers. The laughter of 600 guests surged like a tide against my back, but I didn't run from the mockery. I walked toward it. Every step on the polished marble was a heartbeat, a rhythmic affirmation of a woman who had already found it in her heart to forgive a world that insisted on being cruel. Gisselle Vantage watched me from the stage, her chin tilted in a pose of ultimate triumph, convinced her words were arrows meant to pierce my soul. She was wrong. They were merely echoes bouncing off the walls of a room built on high-interest debt and vanity. As I navigated the gauntlet of sneering faces, I remembered the old saying that no one can make you feel inferior without your consent. Tonight, my consent was the one thing Gisselle couldn't buy. I passed Lyle, who was leaning heavily against a fluted pillar. His face flushed a deep, unhealthy crimson. He let out a sharp, whiskey-breathed snicker as I neared, but my eyes caught the slight tremor in his hands, and the way he gripped his empty glass like a lifeline. He was the golden boy of the Vantage Empire, yet he looked more like a drowning man than a prince. I didn't feel the sting of his insult. I felt pity. For a split second, I placed a steadying hand on his tuxedo-clad shoulder. "Take care of yourself, Lyle," I whispered, my voice devoid of malice. He blinked, stunned into a temporary silence by the unexpected touch of kindness. Looking out at the sea of guests, I didn't see enemies. I saw people blinded by the synthetic glitter of a dying dynasty. True wealth, I knew, wasn't found in an offshore bank account, but in the quiet peace of one's own conscience. The stage lights were harsh, a blinding white that stripped away the shadows of the ballroom and left only the cold, hard reality of the woman standing before me. I reached the steps and climbed them with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who had nothing left to lose. Gisselle held the microphone like a scepter, her posture radiating a regal, terrifying arrogance. The room fell into a heavy, expectant silence, the kind of hush that precedes a public execution or a desperate plea for mercy. I didn't offer a plea. I simply reached into the folds of my dress and pulled out the crimson envelope. It was a stark, blood-red slash against the pale silk of my surroundings. "Is this a bill for your rent, Callista? Or a handwritten apology for wasting our time?" Giselle's voice amplified through the speakers, dripping with a condescending sweetness that made my skin crawl. I didn't flinch. I held the envelope out to her, my arm steady and my gaze locked onto hers. "It is a gift of clarity, Mother," I replied, my voice carrying a quiet authority that didn't need a microphone to be heard. "We all eventually have to face the truth of what we've built. I thought today, of all days, you should see exactly where you stand." The crowd rippled with a confused murmur. They expected a breakdown, a daughter begging for a scrap of the Vantage legacy. Instead, they were witnessing a transition they didn't yet understand. Gisselle ripped the envelope open with a sharp, impatient flick of her manicured thumb. She pulled out the single sheet of heavy, gold-edged vellum and held it up to the light. It was blank, save for a large, embossed Greek letter O, the omega, at the very center. To her, it was a cryptic insult, a final, empty gesture from a daughter she had already written off. She let out a jagged laugh, waving the paper toward the cameras and the front-row tycoons. "A blank page? This is as empty as your future, Callista," she crowed, her eyes bright with the thrill of the kill. She didn't know that in the cold language of high-stakes mergers and hostile takeovers, the Omega symbol was the internal code for a final liquidation event. I had just handed her a formal notice that her reign was over, but her ego was a blindfold she refused to remove. The irony of the moment was a bitter weight in my chest. Below the stage, Sherri began to clap, a slow, rhythmic sound that the rest of the room quickly took up as a mockery of my supposed failure. I stood there, absorbing the vitriol as if it were nothing more than a summer rain. I thought of the philosophy that the biggest test of a person's heart isn't how they handle the applause of success, but how they handle the silence of being misunderstood. I was the one holding the keys, yet the room was cheering for the woman who had just lost the lock. It was a tragic, cinematic display of human folly. Gisselle was celebrating a victory that had vanished 10 minutes ago when the market triggers hit the wires in New York. I took a breath, the air in the ballroom suddenly feeling thin and recycled. I gave a final respectful bow to the woman I once called Mom. It wasn't a bow of submission, nor was it a bow of defeat. It was a bow of farewell. I realized then that my love for her was actually what made this ruthlessness necessary. She needed to lose her hollow power to have any chance of finding her soul. This public encounter served a dual purpose. It was my final goodbye, and it was constructive notice under Illinois civil procedure. By handing her that document in front of 600 witnesses, I had ensured she could never claim in court that she wasn't warned of a material change in her company's status. The legal gears were already turning, indifferent to her laughter. I turned away from the blinding spotlights, walking back toward the shadows of the exit. Giselle's voice followed me, a sharp, triumphant call for the band to play a celebratory set, but I was already miles away in my mind. The night was cold, the kind of Chicago chill that bites deep into the bone, but I welcomed it. Near the oak doors, I caught Kael's subtle nod from the shadows. He looked at his watch, his face a mask of professional intensity, and whispered into his collar mic, "Execute Phase 2. The lake is freezing!" I pushed the doors open and stepped out of the palace. The wind coming off Lake Michigan was fierce and honest, a cleansing force that felt far warmer than my mother's smile. The biting wind of Lake Michigan swept across the private balcony of the peninsula, cutting through the thin silk of my dress with an honesty I found refreshing. Behind the heavy glass doors, the muffled hum of the gala music continued, a distant soundtrack to a world I no longer inhabited. The scent of carnations had finally faded, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of the oncoming storm and the vast, dark expanse of the water below. Standing there, watching the Chicago skyline glitter like a collection of cold jewels, I felt a transition occurring deep within my bones. Moving from the blinding, predatory light of the stage to this silent darkness didn't feel like a retreat. It felt like coming home. I leaned my elbows against the cold stone railing, watching the churning whitecaps of the lake. There is a specific kind of peace that comes when you stop trying to force life to be what you once wished it was. I spent 3 decades mourning the mother Gisselle Vantage could have been, the one who might have looked at her youngest child with something other than calculated disappointment. Standing in the dark, I understood that my suffering had always been the gap between my expectations and her reality. Peace is the result of retraining your mind to process life as it is. Rather than as you think it should be, I wasn't losing a family. I was finally letting go of a ghost. A shadow shifted near the corner of the balcony, silent and steady. I didn't need to turn to know it was Kael. He didn't offer hollow pity or the kind of frantic, "Are you okay?" that usually follows a public shaming. He simply existed in the space beside me, a sturdy presence that asked for nothing. It is a profound irony that the people who carry the most weight in your life are often the ones who don't share a single drop of your blood. I thought about the countless Mother's Days I had wasted, pouring my heart into gifts and gestures meant to buy a smile that Gisselle had already sold to the highest bidder. Kindness is not a weakness, but a choice that the cruel can never understand. Gisselle mistook my patience for submission, never realizing that the quietest people often have the loudest plans. Kael stepped forward, his silhouette sharp against the city lights. He held a gold-embossed leather folder, the kind Gisselle used for the most important Vantage contracts. The paper inside rustled, a dry, expensive sound that carried the sting of official rejection. He didn't say a word as he handed it to me. I didn't need to ask what it was. It wasn't a lawsuit or a bill for the evening's catering. It was a formal notice of disinheritance and familial exile. The signature at the bottom was still slightly damp, the ink reflecting the dim light of the balcony. Gisselle had signed this document just 10 minutes before walking onto that stage to accept an award for her nurturing leadership. Under the Illinois Probate Act, she was well within her rights to cut an adult child out of her will. But Gisselle Vantage never did anything halfway. This document included a non-disparagement and no-contact clause, a legal attempt to erase my very existence from the family history. She was essentially paying to pretend I had never been born. I ran my thumb over the signature, feeling the slight indentation the pen had made in the heavy vellum. She had signed away her own flesh and blood while a room full of people cheered for her virtue. I didn't feel the anger I expected. Instead, I felt a strange, hollow sort of freedom. The chains of belonging had been snapped by the very person who forged them. I handed the folder back to Kael, my face a mask of unshakable calm. "She thinks she is closing a door on me," I said, my voice barely louder than the wind. "She doesn't realize she's just locking herself inside a burning house." Gisselle believed that by taking away my name, she was taking away my power. She had no idea that I had spent the last 8 years building a sanctuary where her name held no currency. The arrogance of the Vantage legacy was its own blind spot. While she was busy curating an image of perfection, she had neglected the structural rot of her own empire. That rot was about to become public, and no disinheritance order in the world could stop the coming tide. I turned my back to the lake, looking at my reflection in the glass doors. The city lights glittered in my eyes, making me look like someone I didn't quite recognize. Someone sharper, colder, more prepared. Forgiveness is the smell that the flower leaves on the heel that crushed it. I realized then that I did forgive Gisselle. Not because she had earned it, but because I refused to carry the weight of her hatred into my future. I deserved peace more than she deserved my resentment, but forgiveness didn't mean I would let the destruction continue. I asked Kael about the black helix triggers. He checked his phone, the blue light illuminating a face etched with professional intensity. "The SEC filings are live, Callista," he whispered. "The dark pool buyback is hitting the ledgers as we speak. In 60 minutes, the Omega event you handed her will be an undeniable reality." The trap was no longer a plan. It was a functioning machine. Yet even as the gears turned to strip Gisselle of her throne, I found myself making a different kind of request. I told Kael to ensure that Giselle's personal medical trust remained untouched and fully funded. Even as I took her empire, I would not let her go without the care she might one day need. We do not become the monsters we fight. If I acted out of pure malice, I would be no different than the woman who just tried to erase me. I adjusted the sleeves of my coat, feeling the adrenaline of the silent hunt beginning to surge. The 600 seconds of my disappearance from the ballroom were almost up. I was no longer the disgrace Gisselle Vantage had presented to the world. I was the storm that would clean the slate of her corruption. I was ready to walk back into that room and show them all that a woman's worth is not a gift granted by her parents, but a kingdom she builds with her own hands. The transition from victim to architect was complete. I felt a sense of purpose so absolute it made the cold wind feel like a warm embrace. Kael suddenly looked down at his tablet, his brow furrowing as the screen flashed with a series of urgent notifications. His face went pale, the professional mask slipping for the first time all evening. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and urgency. "Callista," he said, his voice tight. "We have a problem. Sherri just used her emergency override. She's authorizing a wire transfer of $50 million out of the Vantage South subsidiary. She's trying to drain the accounts before the takeover locks the system." The air on the balcony seemed to freeze. Sherri wasn't just being cruel anymore. She was burning the evidence of her own greed. I turned back toward the ballroom doors, the woman they called a disgrace about to become the only person capable of saving the family from its own darkness. I didn't panic when Kael leaned in, the blue light of his tablet casting ghostly shadows across his face as he whispered about Sherri's $50 million wire transfer. Panic is a luxury for those who live without a plan, a frantic heartbeat for those caught in a current they cannot control. I simply reached into my jacket and tapped a single, pre-programmed command on my encrypted device. The digital pulse traveled through the peninsula's secure network, bypassing the hotel's vanity and striking deep into the central nervous system of Vantage South's holding bank. Through Black Helix, we triggered an immediate lean and freeze under my newly established 51% jurisdiction. In the eyes of Illinois corporate law, Sherri wasn't just moving money, she was committing wire fraud against a majority shareholder. I watched the processing bar on the screen turn a sharp, final red, the digital equivalent of a portcullis slamming shut. "It's done, Kael," I said, my voice as steady as the marble floor beneath us. "The funds are locked in the clearinghouse." I wasn't acting out of a desire to see Sherri crumble, though her greed had made it easy. I was acting as a shield for the 5,000 employees who didn't know their pensions were being used as a getaway fund. The greatest warrior is the one who wins without firing a single shot. And tonight, my weapon was a line of code and the unyielding weight of the law. True power isn't the ability to take. It's the responsibility to protect those who have no idea the storm is even coming. While I'd been standing on that stage enduring Giselle's rehearsed insults, the 600-second timer of the Omega event had been silently counting down. We hadn't bought Vantage shares on the open market where her ego-driven algorithms could track us. We had executed a dark pool buyback, acquiring the pieces of her empire from institutional lenders who were weary of her vanity and Lyle's incompetence. Under Delaware corporate law, a majority shareholder can act by written consent, bypassing the board's posturing entirely. I was no longer a daughter waiting for a scrap of recognition or a seat at a table that was already rotting. I was the majority owner, and I was simply waiting for the clock to strike zero. I thought about the years Gisselle taught me how to dress, how to smile, and how to behave in front of Chicago's elite. She was so focused on outward appearances that she didn't realize I was busy learning how to run the shop. Family disgrace was just a label she used to mask her fear of my independence. There's a profound tragedy in witnessing a family fall apart so a company can rise, but some structures are built on such warped foundations that they must be torn down for anything genuine to flourish. I whispered to Kael to make sure the transition team was ready, because tomorrow, the only people who would lose their livelihoods would be those currently drinking champagne in the ballroom. I paused in front of a mirror in the secluded corridor, adjusting the collar of my dress. The woman staring back at me didn't look like a victim, and she certainly didn't look like a disgrace. She looked like a woman who had survived a mother's calculated hatred to build a sanctuary of her own making. A person's worth isn't defined by the name on their birth certificate, but by the legacy they choose to birth themselves. I reminded myself that silence is the ultimate weapon in a world that never stops talking. I didn't need to shout to be heard. The cold, hard numbers on the SEC filings Kael was currently printing would do all the screaming necessary to bring the house down. Kael handed me the physical hard copy of the board resolution, the paper heavy and cold in my hands. It felt like the weight of a decade's worth of ignored birthdays and erased memories finally finding their gravity. "Everything is live," Kael confirmed, his voice barely a breath. "Giselle's personal accounts are already being flagged for cross-collateralization. When you walk back through those doors, Callista, you walk back as the boss." I nodded, the adrenaline of the silent hunt settling into a calm, focused resolve. It was time to return. The music inside was reaching a crescendo, the sound of Giselle's laughter drifting through the oak doors like a challenge I was more than ready to answer. I pushed open the heavy ballroom doors, the blast of warm, perfumed air hitting me like an insult. The room was at the peak of its revelry, the guests intoxicated by the spectacle of Gisselle Vantage's perceived invincibility. She was standing at the podium, a champagne flute raised high, her face lit with the predatory glow of someone who believed they had successfully eliminated their only threat. She saw me enter, and a cruel, triumphant smirk spread across her lips. She didn't even put down her glass as she leaned into the microphone. "Back so soon, Callista?" she sneered, her voice amplified to every corner of the room. "I expected you to be halfway to the airport by now. Did you forget your dignity in the hallway? Or did you come back to beg for a taxi fare?" The room fell into a jagged, expectant silence, hundreds of eyes turning to watch the disgrace receive her final lashing. I didn't answer her with words. I didn't cry, and I didn't look away. I simply began the long walk toward the stage, my heels clicking against the marble in a rhythmic, unshakable cadence. Each step was a second closer to the end of her era. Giselle's smirk began to falter, just a fraction, as she realized I wasn't moving like a woman who had been defeated. I was moving like a woman who was coming to collect. I looked at her, and in that moment, the champagne in her hand seemed to turn to ice under the sheer weight of my silence. The silence I brought with me back to the stage was a physical force, a cold front that collided with the sweltering heat of the ballroom's arrogance. Gisselle stood at the podium, her fingers trembling slightly as she gripped the microphone, her eyes flickering with a desperation she tried to mask as rage. Before I could speak, she lunged for her final card. A massive projector screen behind her flared to life, illuminating the ballroom with forged evidence of my supposed crimes. "I didn't just raise a disgrace!" she screamed, her voice cracking under the weight of her own lies. "I raised a thief! Callista has been funneling Vantage's proprietary algorithms into her shadow firm for years." The guests erupted in a chorus of collective gasps and hissing whispers, the court of public opinion ready to hang me without a trial. I didn't shout back. I stood as still as a statue, letting the wave of manufactured hatred wash over me. I've lived through enough storms to know that the louder the lie, the more it fears the absolute silence of the truth. I looked at the screen, and I didn't feel fear. I felt the profound pity of a daughter watching her mother destroy her last shred of human dignity for a news cycle. Power is like a glass house. Once you start throwing stones at others, you've already lost the right to feel sheltered. I saw Giselle's hatred for what it truly was, a brittle mask for the terror of a woman who knew her throne was built on sand. She was fighting for her life, but she was using weapons that had already been dismantled. The heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom suddenly swung open with a synchronized bang that silenced the room. 4 uniformed officers in blue and black moved with a sharp, rhythmic stride through the center aisle. Giselle's face lit up with a smug, predatory satisfaction. "Officers, thank God you're here," she called out, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Arrest her! Arrest the woman who tried to burn this company down." But the officers didn't stop at my side. They didn't even look at me. They walked directly past the stage and surrounded Lyle, who was still standing by the fluted pillar, a glass of stolen champagne halfway to his lips. They weren't there for corporate espionage. They were there for a federal warrant for embezzlement and grand larceny. The room went dead silent, the kind of silence that usually precedes a disaster. Under Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure 4, the evidence I had spent months gathering for the DOJ, the indisputable trail of Lyle's gambling debts paid by company payroll funds, had finally been verified. As the lead officer clicked the handcuffs onto his wrists, the glass Lyle was holding slipped from his numb fingers and shattered against the marble. The sound was like a gunshot in a library. Lyle looked at me, his eyes wide and vacant with the terror of a child who finally realized the game was over. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I just looked him in the eye and said softly, "I tried to warn you on the balcony, Lyle. Truth has a way of catching up when you run too fast." I walked over to Gisselle and took the microphone from her frozen, claw-like hand. I felt the dominant weight of the room shift toward me, a low-angle shot of history in the making. "My mother told you I was a disgrace because I didn't contribute to her legacy," I said, my voice echoing with a cold, hard authority. "She was right. I didn't contribute to it. I bought it." I signaled Kael, and the screen behind me changed. The forgeries vanished, replaced by the certified SEC Schedule 13D filing that proved Black Helix was now the majority owner of Vantage Holdings. Success isn't about being seen in the spotlight. It's about being the one who controls the power when the lights go out. True victory is not in defeating your enemies, but in outlasting their delusions. I turned to address the guests, the same people who had laughed at me only an hour ago. "Many of you were eager to witness my fall," I said, my gaze sweeping across the front row of oil tycoons and media magnates. "But I realized a long time ago that you cannot be buried by people whose opinions are for sale." I looked back at Gisselle, who was physically collapsing against the podium, her empire vanishing into the digital ether. "I am not here to take your house, Mother. I am here to take the keys to the company you are using to hurt people." A clean heart is the only wealth that cannot be bought in a hostile takeover, and as I stood there, I felt richer than I ever had in my life. The room was a chaos of muffled sobs and frantic cell phone calls as the reality of the Vantage collapse began to hit the news wires. I stood at the center of the stage, the architect of a new order, while the family that had tried to erase me was led away by their own choices. It wasn't a moment of revenge. It was a moment of inevitable gravity. The rot had been cleared, and for the first time in 30 years, I could finally breathe without the weight of their expectations crushing my lungs. I wondered how many of you watching this have had to stand your ground when everyone you loved called you the villain. If you have, you know that the silence of winning is the only sound that truly matters. Just as Gisselle opened her mouth to let out a final, desperate scream of defiance, Kael stepped forward from the shadows with a thick, leather-bound legal binder. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked only at her. "Mrs. Vantage," he whispered, his voice carrying just enough to reach the front row. "As of 2 minutes ago, your personal assets have been cross-collateralized against the company's predatory debt. You don't just lose the company tonight. You lose everything." The air seemed to leave Giselle's lungs all at once, and for the first time in her life, she had nothing left to say to the cameras. The ballroom felt less like a celebration and more like a high-stakes courtroom, the air thick with the smell of ozone and the heavy weight of impending judgment. Gisselle sat on the polished floor, her designer gown pooling around her like the wreckage of a fallen kingdom, while the flickering light of the projector cast jagged shadows across her pale, trembling face. I stood over her, the physical hard copy of the board resolution feeling cold and heavy in my hand. For 30 years, this woman had used her voice to define my worth, but tonight, the microphone belonged to me. "Since you've spent the entire evening lecturing this room about my failure to contribute to your legacy, Mother, I think it's time we discussed yours," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, judicial finality. "You didn't build a dynasty. You bankrupted the moral fiber of every soul you touched." I pulled the final termination notice from my leather folder, the crisp paper snapping in the sudden, expectant silence of the room. Giselle's eyes were wide, vacant, the predatory glint finally extinguished by the cold reality of her cross-collateralized debts. I leaned into the microphone, ensuring that every investor, every journalist, and every terrified board member heard the words that would end an era. Per Article 5, Section 2 of our corporate bylaws, as the majority shareholder, I am initiating the immediate removal of the chairperson for cause. I looked down at her, not with the fire of revenge, but with the weary detachment of a daughter who had finally outgrown her own trauma. "Happy Mother's Day, Gisselle. You're fired. Not just from Vantage, but from the right to ever control my name or my narrative again." The punchline hit the room like a physical blow, a rhythmic wave of gasps and camera shutters following the declaration. I didn't spit the words with venom. I delivered them with the stoic gravity of a judge presiding over a long-overdue sentencing. Wisdom suggests that a bridge must sometimes be burned to prevent the rot from crossing back over into the sanctuary you've built. I had spent so long trying to cross that bridge, begging for a sign of love, only to realize that the person on the other side was the one holding the torch. By firing her, I wasn't just taking her company, I was reclaiming the oxygen she had spent 30 years trying to suck out of my lungs. Before the echoes of my voice could fade, Sherri lunged toward the stage, her face twisted in a mask of hysterical, perfumed rage. She screamed that I was a monster, a traitor who was destroying the very family that had given me everything. I didn't flinch as she reached the edge of the platform. Kael stepped forward, his face a mask of professional boredom as he raised a tablet displaying a series of forensic financial ledgers. "I'm not destroying this family, Sherri," I said, my voice cutting through her screeching. "I'm simply stopping the bleeding. You bought that Harry Winston necklace with funds earmarked for the Employee Health Insurance Trust. You didn't just take from me. You took from the people who keep this building standing." I signaled Kael to update the projector screen, and the room watched in a daze as the parasite purge began in real time. The forensic audit flashed across the screen, a digital trail of Sherri's secret wire transfers to offshore shell companies and her personal charity that was actually a front for luxury real estate in the south of France. In the American legal system, the law doesn't care whose daughter you are. It cares where the money went and whose signature authorized the theft. Sherri's face went from crimson to a ghostly white as the numbers laid bare the architecture of her greed. I looked out at the Vantage employees scattered among the guests, the administrative assistants and floor managers who had watched their benefits shrink while my siblings lived like royalty. "I have already established an indemnity fund to restore your pensions," I announced. "The parasites have been removed so the body can finally heal. A leader's first duty is to the truth, not to their own ego," and as I watched Sherri collapse into a chair, I felt the heavy burden of that responsibility settling onto my shoulders. Greed is a bottomless pit that exhausts the person in an endless effort to satisfy a need that can never be reached. I informed the remaining board members that Vantage Holdings would be rebranded under the Black Helix Ethical Charter, effective immediately. There would be no more Vantage secrets, no more family members using the corporate jet as a private taxi, and no more disgraces created to feed Giselle's vanity. I was building a new structure, brick by painful brick, on the ruins of the old one. As the security detail I had hired began to escort Sherri and the sobbing Lyle toward the service exit, Gisselle reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing the hem of my dress. Her eyes were filled with a desperate, manipulative plea, the kind of look she had used to control my father for 20 years. I gently but firmly pulled the fabric from her grasp. "You once told me I didn't belong in this room, Mother," I whispered, looking her in the eye for the last time as an equal. "You were right. I belong in the room where the decisions are made. You belong in the past." I realized that success is the best revenge, but silence is the best response. I had no more words for a woman who had tried to use the legal system to jail her own child for a crime of her own making. Kael stepped to my side and handed me a heavy brass ring holding the keys to the Vantage Executive Suite. A symbolic gesture, yet it carried the weight of a decade's struggle. The dignity I felt in that moment wasn't something I had been born with. It was something I had forged in the fire of their rejection. I watched the crowd part like the Red Sea as I stepped off the stage, my path clear and my purpose absolute. I wasn't just walking into an office, I was walking into the first day of the rest of my life. The era of being the Vantage Disgrace was over. The era of Callista had begun. As the police led Sherri away in handcuffs, the sound of the ballroom doors closing behind her felt like a final, echoing period at the end of a long, painful sentence. Gisselle looked up at me from her position on the floor, and for a fleeting second, the broken mask of the fired mother vanished. A terrifyingly sharp, predatory glint returned to her eyes, a look of pure, concentrated malice that made the hair on my neck stand up. She leaned forward, her voice a jagged whisper that carried only to me. You think you won, Callista? You forgot about the 10-year contract. You forgot what I did to your father before he disappeared from your life. My heart skipped a beat, the ghost of my father's name filling the cold silence between us like a shroud. Giselle's sneer was a jagged blade. Her words about a 10-year contract and my father's disappearance, intended to be her final, desperate strike. I didn't give her the satisfaction of an explanation or a plea. I reached into Kael's leather folder and pulled out a yellowed, heavy document I had spent thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours recovering from the dark corners of a corrupt law firm. I didn't forget, Mother, I said, my voice cutting through the chilled air of the ballroom. I found it. The sovereign release you forced my father to sign while he lay dying in that hospital bed. I found the DNA of your greed. I held the estate waiver and parental rights transfer up so the media cameras could catch every cruel sentence. 10 years ago, Gisselle had accepted a $10 million secret settlement from my father's private life insurance, but it came with a barbaric condition she had authored herself. I had to be erased from the Vantage lineage and sent to live in the state foster care system. She didn't just exile me because I was a disgrace. She sold my childhood, my safety, and my very name to fund her first textile warehouse. I looked at her then, not with the fire of hate, but with a profound, weary pity that felt heavier than any resentment. You traded a daughter for a building, Gisselle, and I truly hope the walls were worth the silence. Some people are so poor that the only thing they have left is their money. I turned my thoughts toward the memory of the man she had tried so hard to bury. This wasn't a game of vengeance. It was an act of restoration. Justice isn't about achieving a perfect balance. It's about giving the truth enough room to finally breathe. I was no longer the girl crying in the back of a social worker's car. I was the woman holding the bill for a decade of stolen life. Gisselle looked broken, her face a map of aging vanity and sudden, sharp terror. She had spent her life believing that contracts were weapons to be used against the weak, never imagining that one day her own signature would be the evidence used to dismantle her world. Despite the coldness of her betrayal, I took a pen from Kael and signed a final, discretionary medical trust. I slid the paper across the podium toward her. I am firing you from the company, but I am not firing you from life, I said, my tone as steady as the sunrise. Your medical bills and a modest apartment in the West Loop are covered by this trust. You will never be hungry, Gisselle, but you will never be powerful enough to hurt another soul again. Living well and with a clean heart is the best answer to those who tried to bury you. To be truly free, you must be able to provide for the person who tried to destroy you, without ever expecting, or needing, a thank you in return. I looked out at the guests, and for a moment, I saw my story reflected in their stunned expressions. I wondered if they would have left her with nothing, or if they understood that peace is only found in being better than the monsters you've had to fight. Under the new Black Helix bylaws I had just authorized, Gisselle Vantage was permanently barred from every corporate property she once owned. She was now a private citizen with no title, no crown, and no daughter to scold. The architectural rot of the Vantage family had been stripped away, leaving only the foundation of the work itself. The security team approached to escort Gisselle through the grand marble lobby, but I raised a hand to stop them. No, I said, pointing toward the heavy metal doors at the side of the stage. Use the service elevator. It's the only appropriate path for those who no longer belong in the room. I watched as they led her away, the metal doors sliding shut on her face with a hollow, industrial clang. It was the last time I would ever see her. There was no dramatic goodbye, no final tears, just the quiet closing of a door that had been ajar for far too long. I walked out of the peninsula and crossed the street toward the edge of Lake Michigan. The Chicago skyline was beginning to turn to liquid gold as the sun broke over the horizon, the light reflecting off the glass towers like a promise. I stood at the water's edge, breathing in the cold, honest air of a new day. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a message from the transition team confirming that the Black Helix takeover was absolute. "Welcome home, CEO," it read. I didn't feel the rush of power I had once expected. I felt the quiet, heavy weight of a woman who had finally found herself. I deleted the message and put the phone away, looking out at the vastness of the water, Closure doesn't come from a confession or an apology you are never going to get. It comes from the moment you finally stop waiting for one. I realized then that I was no longer the family disgrace or the youngest daughter. I was simply Callista. I whispered a final thought to the wind, a quiet mantra for the life I was about to begin. Revenge is nothing more than a business transaction, but peace is the only real profit a person can ever make. As the sun rose higher, the shadows of the Vantage name finally vanished into the light, leaving nothing behind but the clean, open road. I know many of you watching this have been through the fire of family betrayal, left to rebuild your lives from the ashes of someone else's greed. How did you find your way back to your own name?
Tell me your story in the comments below. I read everyone.